Hello, my name is Neil Gregor. I'm Professor of Modern European History at the University of Southampton, and I'm the Director of the Parkes Institute. In this short film, we'll be looking at the paper of James Parkes himself, the man after whom our institute is named. And I'm delighted that to help me with this, I'm being joined by Richard Harries, the former Bishop of Oxford, who has been a distinguished observer and commentator on James Parkes' work throughout his career. So Richard, for you, where does James Parkes sit in the wider landscape of interwar Anglicanism?
Well, first of all, he was a truly remarkable man, an amazing pioneer in a field that had never been ploughed before, hugely significant. In fact, you could say that he was one of the most influential Anglican churchmen of his period, even though he's not really very well known. In fact, what he did was so remarkable. And he deserves to be much better known than he in fact is, because of course what he did, as you know better than I do, was actually to discover the extraordinary, appalling history of Christian anti-Judaism, which morphed into anti-Semitism, and he gave his whole life to that. So he was very unlike most Anglican clergymen at the time. Most Anglican clergymen would have been quite happy sitting in their parishes ministering to people, but he was committed first of all to the student movement in Europe, and then when he discovered what was happening in Europe with the terrible attacks on Jewish students and Jewish others, decided he must devote his life to this. So he had this extraordinary strong sense of vocation. Of course, he remained a clergyman and he continued to take services, but he never had a parish of his own. He gave his whole life to this truly remarkable work.
And is it your sense that he was listened to in the Anglican Church at the time? Do you feel that his sort of magnum opus is the conflict of church and synagogue? Do you have a sense that made an immediate impact in the church, or did it?
I don't think it did make a really immediate impact, and I think it's still a long time to come for the whole impact of all that. I don't think even now the church has really come to terms with a terrible history of anti-Judaism and the harm that this has done. He did all this pioneering work, and it's gradually got into the system, and other people have taken up the cause. And I suppose by about the sort of 1980s, the church has begun to wake up, at least to some extent, to this. But I think the lessons of James Parkes have still not been fully learnt, and they need to be learnt afresh in every generation.
So where would you place Parkes' influence in the Anglican Church in a sort of wider conversation about Zionism?
I think what James Parkes said about Zionism and the establishment of the State of Israel was truly remarkable at the time, and still needs to be better known. He put forward a stronger case for the State of Israel than any Jews were doing at the time. He argued that it wasn't just a result of the Holocaust, but there were actually 5 strands to the case for Israel, of which the 2 major ones were, first of all, that there had always been a Jewish presence in the Holy Land, as big as circumstances at the time allowed, and secondly, that the Jews never gave up the hope of returning to the Holy Land. So, as we know, next year in Jerusalem, as is said every Passover. So he argued that the Jewish people had a claim to that land, and the extraordinary thing is that very few Jews at the time were putting forward this. Most of them were thinking of it in terms of response to the Holocaust, but he argued that it was very strong historical roots. But the other remarkable thing about him is that he never forgot the fact that the Palestinians were there, and what he said was that the Jewish people owed a debt of honor to the Palestinian people. Those were his actual words. And the analogy he gives is of the formation of a reservoir which is needed, let us say, by a large town. But the building of this reservoir resulted in a village losing its identity, as of course has happened in North Wales, where the argument is that for the greater good, some harm has to be done to another group. And he recognized that actually harm had been done to the Palestinians there, but he thought it was the greater good that Israel should be discovered. Now you can imagine with that very, very balanced view he had, on the one hand, this very, very strong and compelling state for the state of Israel, but on the other hand, his argument also, as a result of that state, there was a debt of honor to the Palestinian people. He didn't always make himself very popular with either side. You know, people who go for the truth can be criticized from both sides. And actually, I do think that James Parks's narrative and understanding this desperately need to be heard today, because people are so polarized on this issue. And I think if they listen to James Park, they will see where the truth is, and there is an important truth to be recognized both for the state of Israel and also for the Palestinian people.
So was Parks's view of Eretz Israel, of Zionism, of the historical necessity and legitimacy of a modern state of Israel, was that a sort of fringe position within the Church of England at the time, or do you think it was more mainstream in that?
I think the churches were very, very divided after the Second World War, and some of them took a very long time to come around to recognize the state of Israel, partly because of the very ancient links with the churches in the Middle East, of course, and their reluctance to acknowledge the state of Israel. On the other hand, of course, there were certain evangelical Christians who were very, very keen to recognize the state of Israel from the word. So the church as a whole were very, very, very conflicted. I think that the most balanced position of all the church's views after the Second World War was that because the state of Israel matters to Jews, that is part of essential to Jewish Christian relationships, that Christians should be concerned about the safety of Israel. That is a kind of minimum position. But of course, James Park went far beyond that in arguing very firmly to affirm the state of Israel as the historic context for the Jewish people.
So Richard, one of the things that Parks has always been famous for, within the community of people who know his name and are familiar with his work, is his great commitment to interfaith understanding.
Yeah.
I'd be interested in your take of where he fits in with a wider conversation about interfaith relations and interfaith contact and work in the 20th century, and whether you feel that his voice still resonates in those conversations today, or whether you think he's perhaps faded slightly from the...
But I think his main importance is for Jewish-Christian relations, and it's worth noting that the Council for Christians and Jews, which of course has been so important and so significant in the life of this country, actually originated an idea in the place where he was living. He was one of the instigators of that idea, and of course he was on the board of the Council of Christian Jews right from the word go. So first of all, I think you can see his influence in terms of the foundation, the Council of Christian Jews, and the very good work which it did then and which has continued to do, and its influence, if you like, continues through that. I think the other aspect of it which is worth noting is that he was one of the first people, and this is still not acknowledged by a large number of people, to affirm Judaism as a religion in its own right. Christians historically have gone in for what is called supersessionism. They think of Christianity as superseded Judaism, which has remained behind as a kind of living fossil. His starting point was Judaism is a living religion in its own right, and it is within the providence of God that it is still there. And he said that, loud and clear. Of course, it does pose all sorts of questions. Well, what about Christianity? How do you understand the relations of Christianity? He regarded them as both equally valid and both continuing within the providence of God. So his significance, I think, is hugely important then. He was very, very strongly opposed to any attempt to missionize or convert Jews. He thought that Jews should simply practice their own religion, which is what God wanted them to do. So he's very strongly opposed to any attempt to proselytize or mission Jews. And then, of course, from that base of Christian-Jewish relations, he was interested more widely in interfaith relationships. But I think his main significance, obviously, was with Christian-Jewish relationships. where I think he was to some extent heard at the time, but he certainly needs to be heard in our own times.
Okay, so Richard, what we also wanted to do is just have a look at some of the archive holdings that we've got, because Parks's papers are they're remarkable, they're very wide-ranging, there are big aspects of them that really haven't been looked at by scholars at all yet. So we just wanted to show you one or two and see what you made of them. The first two is a letter from Claude Montefiore, who's obviously a very prominent member of the Anglo-Jewish community, and he's writing to Parks to congratulate him on the appearance of the Church and Synagogue volume. And I wondered if it prompted any thoughts for you about Parks's relationship with the Jewish community in the early 30s.
Yes, but it's very good to see these because they are a sign of the huge support that he had from the Jewish community. And without the support from the Jewish community, he wouldn't have been able to do this extraordinary work because he had no regular income. He had no stipend from the church. He was a freelance academic. He didn't have a paid academic job. For a lot of the time, he lived from hand to mouth. I mean, luckily, he lived very simply, and he didn't care very much about possessions. But he was able to do the work because actually he was financed by members of the Jewish community to actually do this work. And that is something I think for which to be very, very grateful. And of course, it has shown huge fruit in the fact that you've got all these documents now indicating, how much support that he had from the Jewish community.
Yeah, I mean, I was struck looking at Montefiore's response at how sort of surprised and grateful Montefiore is that Parks has shown an interest, and one gets the impression that that's unusual for Montefiore, that he read against the grain. You can almost feel a sense that normally the Jewish community doesn't feel as if Anglicans take that much interest in them.
Well, exactly. I mean, most members of the Jewish community, particularly at that time, would think, well, if you saw a Christian, he within 2 seconds be trying to convert you. But actually, a Christian who's actually affirming the glory and the riches of Judaism must have taken them as a very welcome surprise.
Absolutely. And that in itself is a marker of just how unusual pioneering Parks was.
Indeed.
So what we have here is a document from deep in the war, 1943, a campaigning flyer, essentially, from the National Committee for Rescue from Nazi Terror. James Parks is one of a number of very distinguished dignitaries, including the Archbishops of Canterbury and York, the Chief Rabbi, and various members of the Lords and senior military. Victor Gollancz is in there. And the argument is very much a campaigning argument on behalf of taking refugees, those facing persecution on the continent at the moment. So I guess the first question we might ask is, what brought Parks to this point of sort of activist engagement?
Well, of course, by that time, he'd already been committed to that work for 10, 15 or more years. Because, as you know, he worked with students on the continent, and he saw at first hand Jewish people being beaten up in the streets by the Nazi Party as it was beginning to try to obtain power through brutal means. And he was so appalled that, of course, he started from that moment to actually try to do something about it. So everything he said as an academic after that was actually rooted in some very real experience. And of course, as you know, an assassination attempt was made on him by the Nazis, and he was very lucky to escape with his life. I think somebody he knew who was with him was by mistake was actually beaten up instead of him, beaten up very badly. So clearly he was a threat to the Nazis simply because of his campaigning work. So by that time, by the early 1940s, he'd been very, very long committed to this. This just continued work which he'd already been engaged in for more than well over a decade.
I think one of the things that interests me, just looking at the list of signatories, is that Parks throughout his life styles himself as something of an outsider, and much of the biographical literature on him also ascribes a slight sort of awkward outsider role to him, and yet here we see him on a list of very much the great and the good, as it were, which leaves one thinking that perhaps he's a little bit closer to the.
Well, he was an outsider in all sorts of ways, but he was also a networker. I mean, he couldn't have got done what he did without being a good networker, without knowing influential members of the Jewish community, for example. He was very good on on personal relations. He was a very good friend of William Temple,
Yes,
and was very much a protege of William Temple. Indeed, if William Temple hadn't died in 1944, James might have done all sorts of things after that. So I think that it's no surprise to me that he would be part of a list of the great and the good with this particular campaign, because he related very well to people, whether they were wealthy and influential or not. He could relate to people.
Right. So, Richard, we've talked a lot about Parks's role in interwar years and during the wartime, and that's probably the period for which he's most famous. That's the period in which his most famous book is written. But I think it's actually quite underappreciated that 2/3 of his writing career was actually the post-war period. He lives into the 1980s, and he's writing very actively well into the 1970s. And he's not just writing academic histories, he's also positioning himself as a far more public commentator on a wide range of affairs, most notably on the Middle East. So one of the many underused aspects of his archive, I think, is the massive collection of pamphlets and lectures and drafts of this and that, where he's offering a very thoughtful but also very positioned commentary on the developing situation in the Middle East after 1945. So what we've got here is one of those texts, which is I think it's a draft of an article on the Arabs and Jews in the Middle East perspective, which is published in 1972. So relatively late in his life and in his career. I wondered if you had a sense of how his views on the Middle Eastern conflict evolved in the wake of the establishment of Israel, the successive wars that Israel fights against its neighbours, the evolution of the Palestinian refugee crisis, and so on.
Well, I think that what he had to say about Israel and Palestine is of continuing importance. And what he said about that is as important as the work he did before the Second World War on the discovery of the extent of Christian anti-Judaism. And I very much hope that there will be people who will work on that part of the archives, because it's desperately needed today. He took a very balanced position, on the one hand, supportive of the state of Israel, but on the other hand, recognizing that the Palestinians had an injustice done to them, and that this needed to be righted. As a result of that, of course, he wasn't very popular with one side or the other, but it is essentially a very true and balanced view which needs to be heard today.
Mm-hmm. So your sense is that whilst being committed to the sort of historical necessity, legitimacy of the state of Israel, he had an equal interest in the needs, I think he would call it needs rather than rights of Palestinians, the equal sense of title to land, as it were, the equal sense of historic presence, and that he believed that there would be ways of coexistence, as it were. Also, he
believed that he believed that there should be, first of all, that there should be a way of coexisting, and he was particularly sad about the fact that so many of the Palestinians were either kicked out or fled. Question mark, very contested historical question. What he would have liked would for the Palestinians to have remained there and to worked out some kind of modus vivendi rather than being outside what was then a much smaller state of Israel in camps, around about and in Jordan. No, he certainly believed that there could and there should be. Sadly, as we know, all these years later, that problem is still with us, and it is worse now than it was in James Parks's time. Even worse. That is the terrible tragedy of it.
Yes, and I suppose what we now recognise as the peace process of the mid-70s onwards, that starts to emerge really at a point where I think Parks is probably starting to withdraw from the conversation, sort of old age and infirmity starting to. So perhaps we'll have to leave hanging how he would. I think there's some work.
But I think there's some work to be done as to how far his views did evolve in that period, from his first sort of statements about the importance of the state of Israel and why it was important, why they had a right to it, and his later later views, shortly before, it'd be very interesting for somebody to do some work in that area.
Absolutely. Well, Richard, thank you so much. It's been
really
fascinating.
Thank you for
talking
asking
to
me.
you.
Thank you for asking me.
No, we're grateful to you for your time.
Not at all.
It's been really interesting to hear your many insights.
No, well, all the very best with it. And I do hope more people do use this, library, because it is a huge resource, isn't it?